Welcome to Gradcast, the official podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at the University of Western Ontario.
Hello everyone and welcome to Gradcast, the official radio show of the Society of Graduate Students. I'm Tyson Davis and I'm joined by my co-host
Alex Moszczynski. I'm happy to be here today, and we are happy to be joined by Steve Marti, who is actually doing his PhD in history.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, Steve. Well, it's fitting that you're here today with us because it's Remembrance Day, and we were kind of hoping to have a really great Remembrance Day-centric episode of Gradcast here. So why don't we start, I guess, by getting you to tell us a little bit about what the focus of your research is.
Yeah, so I study the First World War, particularly the home fronts of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And what I look at are voluntary contributions to the war effort, what it is that people try to offer in support of the war, particularly when communities come together. And what I've found is that generally when a bunch of people get together to give something to the war effort, they tend to attach conditions onto it, which tell us a lot about how they understand their place both within the nation and within the empire, and how it is that they are trying to live out that relationship through their contribution to the war effort. So that's roughly what I'm up to.
So what do you mean by conditions? Like, what kinds of conditions do people attach to the things that they're contributing?
Yeah, so it's kind of like when a donor bequeaths money to a university for a scholarship. Usually when that scholarship gets posted, it'll have conditions like this has to be a student who studies a particular subject or is involved with a particular extracurricular activity or is of a particular cultural background. And that tells us then about what the donor's values are, because that's what they've decided to do. So what we find are groups will want to gather funds to say purchase an ambulance for the war effort, and they'll say like there's this club in Innisfail, Alberta. They want to buy an ambulance for the Canadian Army, and the Canadian Army uses a Cadillac as the chassis upon which they have their motor ambulances, and they say, well, we're sufficiently patriotic that we would like this to be a Canadian manufactured ambulance, which is great for, you know, the militia department who's getting a free ambulance, but it's terrible for the medical services because now they have this one oddball ambulance and no spare parts for it, because their whole system is meant to have like a Cadillac, and the whole imperial system is kind of faced with this challenge of potentially receiving one odd ambulance by a random manufacturer just because the donors wanted to buy a Canadian ambulance because they felt particularly Canadian. And so there's a bit of a negotiation between the donors and the defense authorities over should we accept this gift and respect what the donors wish, or do we say, sorry, you need to give us $2,000 and we'll buy an ambulance of our choosing, and potentially lose the goodwill of the donor. So that's kind of the exchanges that I see playing out in my research.
Do you see this more complex when you talk about sort of Canada and Australia? What was the other country? New Zealand?
New Zealand, yeah.
The complex demographics between both settler native, and then in Canada you have the English and French backgrounds there. And do you have any like kind of thoughts about or research done on like what happens in like the French communities or reservations or such?
Yeah, so the French communities are particular to Canada, and across the nation, French Canadians are a minority. Within Quebec, they're still a majority, so there's a difference between how French Canadians in Quebec contribute to the war effort versus French Canadian communities outside of Quebec. So there are communities in Western Canada that are trying to raise a French Canadian battalion, and so they need about 900 volunteers to raise this battalion, and it'll be the 233rd Battalions Canadiens Français du Nord-Ouest, and they're struggling to raise to fill the ranks, and they're as the militia department is trying to pressure them into finally making a decision about whether or not they're actually going to have this, they're increasingly fearful that they'll be lumped in with a French Canadian battalion from Quebec, because then they lose the identity of being French Canadians of Western Canada, because the French Canadians of Western Canada are particularly concerned about demonstrating their participation in the war, because they're afraid that they might be marginalized for not participating in the war. In 1913, the year before the war, Ontario had passed Regulation 17, which restricted French language education within the province, and all the French Canadian communities outside of Quebec are fearful of similar regulations that are going to restrict French language rights outside of Quebec. And so one of the ways that they try to mitigate this is by making these visible contributions to the war effort. And so it's interesting in Canada that French Canadian communities outside of Quebec are particularly concerned about maintaining a separate identity from Quebec for that reason.
Though I'm assuming, like, for like logistical reasons, they would probably try to keep all of the francophone military, like all of the soldiers who are speaking French in the same umbrella, which probably meant stuffing them under some Quebecois general or something or other, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly what happened. The 233rd Battalion was broken up, and it was fed into the battalion from French Canada, and so their officers put up quite a bit of a fight. I think two of them were displayed some behavior that was, I guess, what the military authorities would call insubordinate. They tried to protest it, but there's really nothing they could do, and so they were lumped into this French Canadian battalion from Quebec, and that was kind of the end of it. Yeah.
I heard you mention something about Canadian Aboriginals suffered in similar ways. As a Canadian Aboriginal, I just wanted to hear some more about that. So is it similar to the French ordeal? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting is the Department of Militia in 1915 tries to get civilians to bear the cost of recruiting by allowing local communities the opportunity to raise their own battalions. And so that's why we have French Canadian battalions starting up in Western Canada. There's also a Scandinavian battalion. But there is a color bar on this policy that there's the Japanese community in in Vancouver try to raise a battalion, and it comes back that Japanese Canadians are allowed to enlist, but not allowed to form anything larger than a company. And the same answer comes back from African communities, and the same thing comes back for most efforts to raise First Nations unit. There are some interesting examples. The 107th Battalion, I think in Regina, and the 114th, which was raised in Brantford, are largely First Nations, and to a certain extent can demonstrate certain kind of within their paraphernalia that they are a First Nations battalion. So the 114th, their cap badge has two crossed tomahawks on the bottom to show that they are at least partly a First Nations battalion.
Cool. And was the experience similar for Aborigines and Maori people too?
Oh no. So it changes completely. In Australia, the official policy is that to qualify for military service, a person has to be, and the exact rule is, of sufficiently European parentage, which essentially means that at least during the first part of the war, it completely barred Australian Aboriginals from enlisting. And in 1915-1916, when they were low on recruits, they changed it to Aboriginals who were at least 50%, had at least one parent who was of European descent. But what that means is that for Aboriginals to volunteer for service in Australia, there's no opportunity to come together as a community and form a battalion like they could in Canada, because it is decided at the level of the individual, and the medical officer will, when they do their medical inspection, that's when it's determined what their parentage is. And there's an interesting case of one Aboriginal Australian soldier who, if you look through his service records, you'll have his medical inspection form from him the first time he tried to enlist it, and it says something like not fit for service on account of color. And then a year later, he tried to enlist with a different recruiting office and managed to get in. But in his file, it still has that first medical inspection record where it says that he was not eligible because of his race.
Wow. I guess aside from, total racism, is there a reason that they would have had, like, on paper to try to justify doing that? Like, what would be the rationale for barring people from joining the military? Because, I mean, you need as many able-bodied people as you can get.
Well, a lot of it does come down to racism, and I think what this really shows is that, at least at that time, the ideas of what it meant to be Canada, or what it meant to be Australia, and New Zealand is a separate case, but it was constructed in terms of whiteness. One of the interesting kind of examples that comes from the African community in Toronto, they tried to raise a battalion, and the Department of Militia says, well, you can start by raising a platoon, so you have about 30 volunteers that then have to fit into another battalion, and then the Department of Militia goes around to all the other units in Ontario saying, we potentially have a platoon of Africans, would you be willing to take them in? And I think they send it out to about 70 battalions that are recruiting. All of them say no. But the reasons that they state are not sort of what we would assume as racist in the terms that they're seen as unfit for service. It's the kind of racism that constructs their community in terms of whiteness. So there's a battalion that says, we are a battalion that is being raised in this community. There are no Africans in this community, so it would not be authentic for us to have an African platoon because we are a white community, and that comes out quite a few times. And so again, it's that kind of idea that Canada and Australia are very much white nations, and that's going to be reflected in their mobilization.
That's really interesting because I was always perplexed by the strong racism that did happen in Canada and Australia, but yet I do know that World War I was, if at least on the British side, was fought largely by a whole bunch of their soldiers from India. And they had no trouble taking Indian troops, but then again, like the idea of defining Canada as the white country kind of explains that.
Yeah, I mean there's a bit more to it. There are a lot of officers within the militia who encourage minorities to enlist, and largely they see it as a means of assimilation. And so, there are a lot of people who believe that that allowing First Nations Canadians to enlist and indoctrinating them with military culture and military discipline is going to be the way that First Nations Canadians can assimilate into sort of white Canadian European society. So we see a lot of exclusion, but in Canada there's a very kind of there are no really clear policies. Everybody kind of does their own thing, and so this is why we have some battalions of First Nations that are able to draw recruits, and it's largely to do with this idea that this is, at least the white officers believe that this is going to be a way to assimilate First Nations, whereas the First Nations who volunteer see this as their way of gaining citizenship by demonstrating their service to the nation, and hopefully this will be rewarded after the war.
Okay.
Wow, it baffles me that a qualification to be a soldier is whiteness. Like, did they have like a picture on a wall, and if you're darker than this picture you can enlist, like that?
Like in the Australian case, like I said, that was the only place where it's clearly defined that a soldier had to be of sufficient European origin, and it was left up to the medical officers to decide. Some of them took it very seriously. I know that one medical officer is noted to have said, those are some of the darkest half-castes that I've ever seen, and obviously this being that Aboriginals are claiming that they're half Aboriginal to get in, and he's just kind of going along with it and letting them enlist regardless. So yeah, there is no set color bar, but it's one of those things that we find these odd cases of people enlisting despite that, and then it's a question of how do we include them in the memory of the war afterwards.
So, well, but getting back to sort of what the focus of your research is a little bit, what other kinds of contributions, aside from either trying to form a battalion or a platoon or getting ambulances, what other kinds of contributions did people make? And what kinds of conditions have you seen across the board? And I guess to further that even more, between Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, what kind of differences did you see?
So one of the biggest things, or the two big things that I found, are sock knitting and raising money. So women in all three contexts knit a lot of socks and other, mittens and other comforts. What's interesting is when they get together as a group, they'll kind of decide how it is that these socks are going to get overseas. And generally what we find is that there's a desire primarily to send socks to the local soldiers. And so, you'll have women who knit socks as part of the Red Cross, which is an international organization, and there will be a collection by the National Red Cross or the Provincial Red Cross for a shipment of socks, and a particular club will say, oh, well, they're asking for socks to be sent at like a provincial level, but we're actually just going to send the socks to make sure that they go to our boys overseas. And generally in Canada and New Zealand, there's nothing to stop that. Australia, two of the states really try to centralize the war effort to make it rational and efficient. And so they try to get away from this idea of you only knit socks for the people that you know, and they try to encourage people to contribute to statewide collections. And basically what they do is they put controls on who is allowed to raise funds publicly. And if you are going to raise funds publicly, it has to be contributed to one of the statewide funds. So there's, in South Australia, there's 7 funds. There's the YMCA, the Red Cross, the South Australian Soldiers Fund, and the Trench Comforts Fund, and a couple of other ones. And if you're going to raise funds publicly, it has to go into one of those funds. And for people to send socks overseas, this usually has to be done through an organization like the Trench Comforts Fund, which is going to cover the cost of shipping. So they need to be able to raise funds to ship these socks overseas, and it's one of the ways in which the government of South Australia tries to encourage people to send their socks to any South Australian soldier rather than just the people that you know. But there's quite a bit of pushback on this. A lot of people, write to the State War Council saying, I have written letters to the people of Little Swamp, South Australia. None of them have received a single cigarette from the Trench Comforts Fund. So why should I contribute to the Trench Comforts Fund when you're clearly not taking care of the soldiers of my community? And so there's quite a bit of pushback on this. And one of the things that we see is that the connection to the war is very much a local, community-driven initiative, where really as much as the war is a war of empire, a war fought across an ocean or 2 oceans in the case of Australia and New Zealand, a lot of the people who contributed were really thinking about the people in their own communities.
And zooming out a little bit, you in history, everything written is a conversation. You're responding to some people and you're saying some things. I'd like to know, what is kind of the main interest, what was the question that you sought out to answer all those years ago when you started this project? And in the end, what contribution do you think you're making?
Yeah, I just kind of started, I was always kind of perplexed by, I guess, just Canadian identity in general. What does it mean to be Canadian? And I had an interest in the First World War from my undergrad degree, and going through my master's, I was struck by the similarities in Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand memory of the First World War as it being kind of the war that defined that nation, and that was kind of what I started looking into, is kind of how identity is constructed or discovered over the course of the war. And then I kind of got into these sources of voluntary contributions, and I found all these kind of nitty details of these negotiations and these conditions of people saying these are the terms by which I'll contribute to the war effort, and that has kind of veered me into that direction. I hope my overall research will kind of help complicate the how it is that we understand identity in the settler colonies of the British Empire. We tend to see the First World War as a transition from colony to nation, but as I was just saying, this big war of empire for a lot of people was just something for the community, and it says something that English Canadians can say we're only doing this for our community, but French Canadians, Indigenous Canadians and migrant communities have a much different set of frameworks that they have to work through in order to contribute to the war effort. So it really kind of complicates how it is that Canadian society comes out of the First World War, and it tells us a lot about how it is that Canada works as a settler colony, and the same for New Zealand and Australia.
Sorry to shift gears a little.
Sure.
I saw one of these Ask the People kind of articles in the Gazette, and I thought I'd bring it up. Do you think Remembrance Day should be a recognized public holiday? So should we actually be here today?
Right.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Alberta where it is a statutory holiday, and yeah, I mean, I thought it was nice to have the day off, and it was the day that I actually used to participate in the services. But I know that a lot of people just treat it as a day off, and so it does get tricky that way. And there were a lot of people who just used the overtime to get in some extra time at work. So I mean, for myself, I would appreciate getting the day off, and I like that I'm a graduate student who can take the day off. But not everybody has that. And I think just recently a bill was passed through Parliament trying to make Remembrance Day a national statutory holiday. So we'll see how that goes.
Mm-hmm. The discussion's kind of nipping at a recent discussion on a very old, long conversation that's been going on. I was talking to Steve right before we went on the radio, and I said that if you pulled a Canadian out from November 11th, 1971, mm-hmm. and dropped them into today, the way that they conceive of Remembrance Day and the way that we conceive of Remembrance Day would be very different.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, I mean, so certainly at the moment, Remembrance Day ceremonies are better attended than they were, say, in the 1970s or even in the 1990s. And I think, looking at the short term with Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, there's definitely a greater awareness of the sacrifices of the Canadian forces, and I think there's certainly a public desire to want to engage with that in some kind of meaningful way. And so there's definitely some recent reasons for why it is that Remembrance Day ceremonies are so much better attended, but because I read a lot of Australian historians who have their own kind of memory of the First World War, who have studied this over the long term, there are far more kind of layers to this phenomenon than just the war in Afghanistan. So there's a lot of moving parts that can be traced back to the 1970s. But yeah.
It's really interesting that you say that. I, for me at least, always, Remembrance Day has been a big deal to me since the early 90s when I was in school, and we would spend basically 2 weeks or even more working on art and poems and making poppies and making huge displays, and the whole day pretty much in school would be spent talking about Remembrance Day and World War I. So I'm kind of surprised, actually. I've never heard until today that there is this growing trend toward people attending Remembrance Day ceremonies. So I really had no clue.
Oh yeah,
a generation ago, your average Canadian might not even have known what Vimy Ridge was about. If you Vimy Ridge was something that was really only known amongst World War I historians until fairly recently, in the last 20 years or so.
So has there been like a real push in the school system within Ontario and I guess other provincial governments to really stress World War I and Canadian history, or like what's the change there? Because for me, growing up, it was a no-brainer. I thought everybody knew about it. I mean, there was McRae Avenue in the neighborhood that I went to school in, and you know, I thought it was actually probably named after John McRae.
Right.
Like to me, it was just this part of everyday life. And I mean, I was talking with my girlfriend earlier in the day actually about wearing poppies, and I've been wearing one for the last couple of weeks, and I see people on the street wearing them, and she said, don't you just wear that today? And I said, well, I don't think so. I've always historically done it for a long time. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, most of my knowledge of this comes from Australian researchers, and one of the things that they've noticed in Australia in the resurgence of their own version of Remembrance Day, which is Anzac Day, celebrated in April, is there was an effort by a conservative government, John Howard's government in the 1990s, to appropriate funds to the Department of Veterans Affairs, which would then use those funds to encourage the commemoration and the education of Australia's history of the First World War in schools. And so they would create resources for teachers to plug into their curriculum so that they would have better resources to talk about the First World War. They could make resources available so that people could that students could either research their own family member who had fought in the First World War, or just any Australian soldier to learn more about their experience. And really this was a response to kind of the decline of Anzac Day in Australia, largely because Anzac Day, and I think Remembrance Day in Canada, had just been kind of something for veterans and the wartime generation who had lost somebody overseas. And as the veterans of the First World War started passing away and the veterans of the Second World War started aging, there became this push to involve the younger generations into Anzac Day, and so the way that they did this was encouraging a personal connection to the war by sort of, you know, the kinds of activities that you were describing. So it's I mean, from what I remember from growing up in Canada, it seems like we've had that same upbringing, and it is one of those things that contributes to the resurgence of Remembrance Day within the last 10 years.
Yeah, and it's odd because it is kind of themed around the First World War, which is really odd because Canada and the Anzac forces got into a much bigger conflict not that much longer later.
Right.
But it doesn't seem to get the same gravity as the First World War, and I've always been curious as to why that is.
Yeah, I mean, that's anyone's guess. I know that you know, Remembrance Day was originally in Canada known as Armistice Day, and there was very much a push to change it to Remembrance Day. Largely, I think Arthur Currie was one of the proponents of changing it to Remembrance Day specifically so that it doesn't become just the commemoration of the First World War, that it actually encompasses all of Canada's conflicts. But you're right that everything has remained rooted in the First World War, and I think it's because you know, it's a much more cryptic war, I think. Like, you know, World War II was a war to defeat Nazism and to do all these good things. It was operationally, it was a very clear war of maneuver and such. You know, the First World War is, you know, trench warfare, mud, the Somme. I think it's still very cryptic, and I think it still captures people's imaginations. So I think that's why it remains the central focus point of Remembrance Day.
That's a great way to finish.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to point out, I may look very unpatriotic not wearing my poppy, but it does not go well over the fresh tattoo. I wanted to shout out the Inkery. Great place to get a tattoo if anybody's thinking about it.
I'm going to get a white poppy for next year.
They do specials for Remembrance Day. They had a special today, $11, and you could get a poppy for Remembrance Day.
All right, so Gradcast, official podcast, or official radio show of SOGS. It will be a podcast one of these days. If you want to come on the show, or if you have any feedback, email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. And shout out to the Twitter at Gradcast Radio. And I'm with Tristan. And Alex and Tyson and everybody else will join you again next week. Have a good week.
That's all for this week. If you want to send us some feedback, or if you want to come on the show yourself, email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. Be sure to hook us up on social media. On Twitter, we're at Gradcast Radio, and look up Gradcast Radio also on Facebook. If you want to subscribe to the podcast is located at gradcast.podbean.com, and it's on iTunes. And while you're there, why don't you leave us a review? It really helps us out. We'll see you guys next week.